Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you once again at the session focused on the Kassák Museum, Budapest. This time, I would like to introduce you two speakers, Merce Pál and Eszter Balázs, who will introduce the research program and exhibition series which follow up this kind of a research. First, I would introduce the lecture itself. I would read the abstract, which would introduce the theme we are going to follow this evening, and then I would introduce the speakers. The session itself is going to be for like 50 minutes. There should be a space for discussion, so don't be shy, ask questions, use chat for that purposes, and I'll read them at the end of the session itself. The discussion is going to be for 20 minutes, so we should end up this meeting around 8:30. The lecture itself is called Life Reform Movements and Avant-Garde Networks, Research and Exhibition Series. The Kassák Museum has two main research projects and exhibition series focused on life reform and social movements in modernity, as well as on Lajos Kassák's avant-garde magazines between the 1910s and 1930s. The first project, led by cultural anthropologist and curator Judit Csatlós, focuses on different aspects of workers' culture in interwar Hungary. The second research project, led by historian Eszter Balázs, examines the networks and milieu connected to Kassák's magazines within Hungary and transnationally, and the debates within them, and resulted in a fundamental reformulation of the role of art and of artists in society. I think this topic especially is quite interesting also for us, because we are in a very similar situation which were in the 30s in Hungary in that time. And we also are able to see parallels between Hungarian context and Czech context in the time, like Tigers circles and lots of others. The presentation by members of the Kassák Museum's research group outlines the main questions of these projects and presents the exhibition and publication series which is based on their findings. Now, the first speaker, Merce Pál, is the head of the department at the Kassák Museum, Budapest, where he works since 2015. He is a member of the research group Lajos Kassák's Avant-Garde Journals from a Disciplinary Perspective, 1915-1928, since 2016. His research focuses on Hungarian avant-garde art and the history of Lajos Kassák magazine Ma, Today, in Vienna between 1920 and 1925, with special emphasis on its international networks. He has curated exhibition in the Kassák Museum in the Virág Judit Gallery, Budapest, and the János Pannonius Museum in Pécs. He has also worked on exhibition in the Hungarian National Gallery and the Berlinische Gallery. His work has been published in several academic journals, exhibition catalogs, and multi-author volumes. Eszter Balázs is the Associate Professor at the Department of Communication and Media Studies of the János Kodolányi University in Budapest. She holds an MA in History from Central European University Budapest and joined PhD from EHESS Paris and ELTE Budapest in the History and Civilization. A book on the critical intellectual and the question of literary autonomy in Hungarian classical modernist literary journals, 1908 and 1940, based on her PhD, was published in 2009. Together with Phil Kazor, they co-authored another on press journalism and photographs taken during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Eszter is on the editorial board of the Hungarian Review. I'll read it in English if I may, Research on Media, as well as being member of the subcommittee on press history of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Between 2014 and 2018, she received a scholarship from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences to work on Hungarian intellectual life during World War I, the result of which was another scientific survey published subsequently. Between March 2017 and September 2021, she led the research group at Kassák Museum, Budapest, with the NKFY project financed by the Hungarian Ministry of Innovation and Technology. The title of the project is Lajos Kassák's Avant-Garde Journals from an Interdisciplinary Perspective, which also Merce takes apart. Now, I would like to welcome them both. It's a special occasion to be able to speak with them and to be able to share with them. Their knowledge of avant-garde is really extremely interesting for us. And I would like to give a space to Merce to introduce research project number one. Merce, welcome, floor's yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to share the presentation with you, and I'm going to start with talking about the exhibition and research program of the Kassák Museum, which has started in 2012 and has been going on ever since. This is a very unique and a very complex research and exhibition series, which was initiated by the curator of the Kassák Museum, Judit Csatlós. She's a cultural anthropologist, and her approach to the avant-garde and interwar Hungarian culture is one which is quite different from an art historical or a literary historical point of view. She utilizes the methods of cultural anthropology and participatory research in her work. And so this research project, which has been going on with the help and with the involvement of several young scholars and curators, has been really one of the most interesting and most intriguing pillars of the exhibition projects of the Kassák Museum in Budapest. And actually this series has received very good reviews, both on a scientific or a professional scale, but also on the scale of the visitors and those communities that have been involved in both creating and visiting these exhibitions in the Kassák Museum. The title of this series is Life, Reform and Social Movements in Modernity. And in fact, this series has been focusing on different aspects of workers' culture and workers' cultural movements during interwar Hungary, which historically was a right-wing era for Hungary with the leadership of Governor Miklós Horthy. But despite this right-wing leadership in the country, several different organized or alternative cultural movements took place, and some of those were especially focused on young workers and their life. Sorry. And one of those who were very much involved in this alternative lifestyle movement was Lajos Kassák during the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s up until the outbreak of the Second World War. He was back then editing a journal called Munka, which translates as work. And this magazine was not focused on avant-garde literature or visual art anymore, but it was much more focused on workers' culture and lifestyle. And even the authors involved and the young intellectuals and workers around this magazine, this group was called the Work Circle. They were much more interested in political and social issues than high art or literature. And this was a very important and very interesting shift in Kassák's interest when he came back from the Vienna exile, where he edited the journal Ma, which was one of the leading forums for avant-garde, constructivist and Dadaist literature and visual arts. He decided to focus much more on the Budapest scene and not talk about the different political issues which took place in the past. So during the First World War and the communist revolution of 1919, but to look into the future and try to make sense of that political and cultural situation which was present in Budapest during the 1920s and the 1930s. And by doing that, he was involved in several different aspirations to change society during the interwar period, which were loosely connected with each other, but also in a way, in a retrospective way, they formed a kind of a network of free thinking and experimental ideas that were present in Hungarian society, which were all socially engaged and were directed towards the working class. And this series of exhibitions and research projects tried to explore the connections that were present between Kassák's movement and his magazine Munka, and those artistic and educational and drive reform and emancipatory movements that were present in Hungary during the interwar period. This series takes upon the task to create and present a social context that was formed around Kassák's movement and his artistic, especially literary output for the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, during this series of exhibitions, we have also been working with other artists, not only historical avant-garde artists, but also contemporary artists who worked with historical materials and tried to reflect on the ideas and the questions that were very much interesting for Kassák and other intellectuals during the 1920s and 30s. So these exhibitions are not exhibitions of visual art or literature, but these are historical exhibitions with a focus on the methods of cultural anthropology. And their main task is to create a discursive space where we can talk about workers' culture and its relationship to the avant-garde, and actually to explore those once existing or still existing communities which were involved in the formation of these back then revolutionary ideas. On the left, you can see the titles and dates of the exhibitions that we had in the Kassák Museum starting in 2012. The first exhibition was about a dance school led by József Magyar, which is a very interesting case of gymnastics and life reform engaged in cultural change or cultural policies. The 2016 exhibition, which was called Vízizri, it's an untranslatable Hungarian pun, actually, was focused on a settlement for workers to spend their free time on the north side of Budapest, so in a few kilometers distance from Budapest, which was formed already during the 1920s and which is still existing today. And it was a It was a vacation field or a vacation settlement on the banks of the river Danube. And this was a curator and her aides, co-curators. They worked with the community which storied their own history in this settlement, and were able to tell exhibition which was called Time for Action, and it focused on social housing movements in Hungary during the 20th century. It started with the turn of the century, so the 19th century, early 20th century, but it went up until the 1990s. And this exhibitors were those who were involved were also taking part in the curatorial and research work. Was very unique and an example of participatory museum strategies. In 2018, there was an exhibition of maybe it's better now. I think that my microphone was wrong. So in 2018, we had an exhibition called Everything is Ours, which was done by a contemporary artist called Adam Albert. And he was working with different aspects or different material remains of the May Day celebration in Budapest during the 1919 Soviet Republic. This was a very interesting case of a contemporary artist reworking or rethinking materials coming from 100 years from the past. And this exhibition was actually the first in this series that involved a contemporary artist reflecting on the historical aspects of workers' culture. And last year, during the winter, we had an exhibition of Eva Besnyő, who was a Hungarian-born photographer, and she was very active both in Berlin during the 1930s and later on up until the 70s in the Netherlands. This was an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition of her photographs, but the whole topic and the curatorial concept of the exhibition was focused on her involvement in workers' culture and her different interpretations of cultural anthropological issues. And actually, we have a virtual version of this last exhibition, the photos of Eva Besnyő, which is available on our website. And I would really encourage you to go on and explore this exhibition in depth, because it was a very interesting and very, very novel way of presenting the photos of Eva Besnyő. For the whole theoretical and methodological background of this research project, I think it's important to pinpoint a few key elements of the term workers' culture. And I think it's important because the whole mindset of this research project and the whole focus of this research project is very different from an art historical or a literary historical perspective. Judit Csatlós and her co-curators use the anthropological concept of culture, which highlights that different meanings of different ideas, of different things, are continuously created, shaped, and maintained based on the participants' interactions, their experiences, and those stereotypical or primary interpretations that are attached to different ideas. This anthropological view also recognizes that culture is an area of conflict, of struggle, and this struggle is towards the definition of these meanings of things and ideas. And there are always a struggle between the dominant interpretation and alternative interpretations. And of course, as this whole arena of culture has a shared experience, and these ideas are constantly changing, and also this could be changed through different groups and different interactions. Therefore, it's really important to try to decode and recover the meanings that were connected to different ideas or different ideologies during the time when different actors or different artists or different individuals were involved in workers' culture. With not going too much into the depths of the methodology of the research project, I think it's really interesting and really important to highlight that the methods of visual anthropology could well be used and utilized during research for an exhibition about interwar workers' culture as well. Judit Csatlós and her co-curators has also been involved in participatory research. I have already talked you briefly about this project with the housing movements and social housing movements in Hungary during the 20th century. And I think that this is a very interesting and very important task for museums today, to find new ways of interacting and involving different social groups and different members of society, not only in consuming, but also in creating the contents and the outputs of museums. The 2016 Vizizri exhibition, which I have already told you was focusing on the free time of organized workers outside of Budapest, was a very interesting case on denoting these different struggles towards the creation of and the interpretation of meanings of culture, which was going on even within these communities as well. This term politicization of leisure is a very interesting approach towards presenting the otherwise, very happy moments of this workers group who were going out of the city on Sundays and during the summer, and camping together and swimming together and doing gymnastics and hikes together. But even though if you dig deeper into the stories, and if you look at the documents, the archives, the notes, the diaries of those who were involved, and actually this was possible as the settlement still has a community which carries on the original intentions of the creators from the 1920s, you can see that there are always conflicts and different fractions going against each other. And of course, there are different levels and different interest groups within the workers' culture. Those who were much more involved in politics, those who were much more involved in, for example, Dada poetry. And this could well mean that the otherwise homogeneously looking group of young workers going outside of the city was in fact a much more politicized and much more structured group during the 1920s than as it seems today. This is a photo, anterior photo of the Time for Action exhibition. Actually, it was a huge research project with archival work, with personal stories, and I think it's a very important keyword to highlight: polyphony. The polyphony of different perspectives, the polyphony of different interpretations, because the different levels, it was a very important experience for the curators and those who were involved in the project, that the perspective of the researchers who were affected with housing problems, and the curators, and even the social policy, so the official interpretation of housing problems during the long 20th century, this had very different interpretations and very different points of view. And this exhibition was actually a great opportunity for everyone who was involved, and also those who participated in the project, to learn about the different interpretations and the different feelings and the different problems that could be raised on the basis of one story, of one particular individual's story, or one particular building's story, or one particular event's story. And all these different perspectives were integrated into the exhibition, and all these different stories were told not only by, so it was not only a curatorial narrative that went on in this exhibition, but it was also a polyphonic narrative which incorporated the interpretations of everyone who was participating in the exhibition. Okay, I have already told you about this community of the Horány settlement, and this is actually a photo of those who were living there formerly and those who are still living there in Horány. The background shows the interior of the exhibition in the Kassák Museum. And of course, this resource community is only one example, but all the other exhibitions and all the other research projects during the past years in the series of the Kassák Museum involved different kinds of civilian experts and resource communities who were able to provide materials for the exhibitions and who were able to provide their own stories and their own interpretations of these documents, which could be very different from those of a historian or a curator. The participatory aspect of this research project is also very important. I have already told you most of the pinpoints that are shown in this in this slide, but I think it's already it's also very important to highlight that in retrospect, and Judit and her co-curators already wrote an article about the results of this this participatory research project. So the results was on behalf of the researchers living in homelessness who were involved in the project, that it was a very fruitful cooperation, and it was a very fruitful project. They were doing it for more than 1 year. They were gathering in the museum every month, sharing their research results and discussing, debating the ideas that could be involved in the exhibition. And actually, this was a very important change of focus for them as well, because they were able to see problems that affect their own lives very drastically from a historical or a more broader perspective during this research project. So in general, I think that this exhibition series is a very unique project initiated by Judit Csatlós in the Kassák Museum. And I'm very happy that I was able to share the results of this series up until today with you. And now I would like to finish this part of the lecture and continue with periodical research, avant-garde networks. And I would like to give the microphone over to Eszter, my colleague, who can continue with this project. And I will mute myself for now. Thank you very much.
So it's my turn. Okay, I don't know if I'm visible enough.
Yes, I can see you, Eszter.
Yes.
Okay, you can see me. Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Hello, hello everybody. I like to first thank you, the organizers, for the kind invitation to contribute to this event as a speaker. So I'm Eszter Balázs, I'm historian, and I've been working as a director of a research group in the Kassák Museum since 2017. This evening I'm going to outline this ongoing scientific project. First of all, I try to answer why pursuing academic research can be legitimate in a museum. For this purpose, I like to briefly present the academic aspect of our museum. The Hungarian Petőfi Literature Museum and its branch, the Kassák Museum, specialized in the avant-garde arts, are also research and innovation centers according to the 21st century open museum profile. The main task of the Kassák Museum is not only the collecting, the preserving, and the presenting of Kassák's oeuvre, and to build his memory as a writer, artist, and editor, and even public intellectual, but also the interpretation and the detailed explanation of his and his colleagues' activities, artistic and social activities, and even political activities, because time to time they were involved in politics, more particularly in the turmoil after the First World War. But even during the First World War, they had a very anti-war stance. So they had an anti-war attitude, and by this, of course, they had a sort of they took part in mobilization against the war. So generally speaking, our exhibitions deal more with problems related to history, literary history, and art history than with biographies and objects only, and consequently are based on collective research. At the same time, through the exhibitions, we try to offer informal learning opportunities about art and society thanks to digital technologies, for instance, infographics, supposed to boost visitors' creativity. Thanks to our complex museum pedagogical activities, we tend to address to all ages of youngsters, from the elementary school to the secondary, as well as to university students. As a museum of the avant-garde of strong international aspect, Kassák Museum is also a par excellence intercultural platform capable of enriching not only the national culture, but also the cultural life worldwide. It has a strong impact on individuals and groups interested in artistic innovation, whether coming from the close neighborhood from the north of Buda, or from the entire Budapest, even the entire country, and also from abroad. So Kassák Museum is also takes part also in the very rich cultural tourism in the Hungarian capital. Taking all this into consideration, the museum staff decided to organize, to dedicate an exhibition to Kassák's first journal called Otet the Deed, which, sorry, I was a little bit in a hurry. So first of all, I want to stress that the staff decided to apply for a grant to start extensive research on Kassák's avant-garde journals, which had been quite a big gap waiting to be filled in Hungarian historiography. The second time we applied, bingo, we got a 4-year grant from the National Research Development and Innovation Office of the Hungarian state to examine Kassák's journal, avant-garde journals, from an interdisciplinary perspective for the period between 1915 and 1928. 1915, because the first journal, the first avant-garde journal, Kassák launched in 1915, that was Otet the Deed, and the last avant-garde journal of an avant-garde characteristic was launched in 28, called Document. So with this project called Kassák's Avant-Garde Journals from an interdisciplinary perspective, our principal goal was to edit a collective monography on this topic. But since 2016, when the project was officially launched, we have attended several international conferences and published many articles related to the main topic in Hungarian, as well as in English, and even in German and in Czech, for instance. These publications are dealing with Kassák's journals and international networks in a large cultural, historical context. The main points are the terminology of artistic innovation, the realization of such innovation in poetry and in visual arts, the question of the new man and new society, the attitude of the avant-garde towards politics, towards the war, towards the revolutions that follow in the aftermath of the war, the changing context of running a journal, as well as the international networks to what Kassák's journals were somehow linked. During the research period, which was prolongated by 2 extra non-paid years due to the global pandemic situation until September 2022, so it is a still ongoing project. What we have done. First of all, we've been working on a digital edition of Kassák journals edited between 1915 and 1928. These journals will be accessible on the digital philological webpage of the Polyphony Literature Museum. Not only the scanned version of these journals will be available, but they will be presented to the public in a searchable manner. Besides, we set up a database as complete as possible about Kassák's publication, as well as about the press covering all these activities of Kassák and of his colleagues for the period. For the time being, it's for internal use only. Third, moreover, we are about to complete the transcription of Kassák's correspondence for the period that has been never published before, never edited before, which is quite exceptional because the majority of the renowned writers in the 20th century, and of course even before, have been edited in print format. So it's quite a big gap we have to fill thanks to the transcription of his correspondence. And of course, which is a gold mine for any historian to complete information coming from other type of more visible and more official sources, like publications, like articles appearing in the big press. In addition, we engaged to link museum work with research. The first exhibition in 2015 related to Kassák's avant-garde journals was an exhibition organized by the museum staff, future members of the future research team, to commemorate the centenary of the deed of the first avant-garde journal that was long time kept in the shade by historiography. The related research was published in exhibition catalog, as well as in an informative and broadly illustrated volume that was supported by the Hungarian National Cultural Foundation with the intention to disseminate knowledge about Kassák's journal and editorial activity. In 2016, the staff created another exhibition to commemorate the launch of MA, which is the second avant-garde journal of Kassák, launched in October 1916. Kassák's second and it was a considerably more artistic journal than the first one. Thanks to these exhibitions, new questions had risen that we could later deepen in the research work started by the end 2016. The work process has had two main directions. Our work process has had two main directions, so to say. One has been attending international conferences with call for papers. The second, doing research on the journals themselves, including press about these journals, as well as correspondences and also other types of archive materials that could put the context of the journals more into light. So it is not only the close reading of the journals, not only the deep examination of these journals, but also the interpretation of editorial work in intensively changing contexts. So in the context of the First World War, after in the context in the revolutions, in the aftermath of the war, and also in the exile period, because Kassák had to flee the country after the revolution followed the First World War. And so it was a very intensive, a sort of turmoil as a period. By attending international conferences with a call for papers helped us to create new perspectives or refresh already existing perspectives in the research field, and so to create a partly new framework for the research. In 2016, in Rennes, in France, for instance, we attended the annual international conference of the European Network for Avant-Garde and Modernism Studies, whose main focus was on the question of spiritual and intellectual orientation of the historical avant-garde, whether the historical avant-garde went in the direction, oriented towards science, whether oriented towards ontology. This topic that has never been studied in the Hungarian context related to the avant-garde before, offered us a completely new perspective to deal with Kassák's journals. To give you another example, in 2017, we attended an international conference organized by the Milan University in Italy, which dealt with the clash in periodicals. Since Kassák's journals went through several huge internal crises, this specific angle we found very enriching, very relevant to our research topic too. The exhibition we made called Active Diagrams, focusing on Kassák's second journal, more strong networking with other avant-garde journals, that we realized in 2018 was entirely based on our research project. While the 2015 exhibition was a good example of how museum work can be utilized in research work, Active Diagrams is a good example of making benefit of already extensive and intensive scientific research for museum work. It was also a good opportunity to make us think how these research outcomes and outputs can be shown for visitors. Our main engagement, however, has been analysis, so to say, the close reading of the journals with a monthly or a half-monthly publication for the period 1915 to 1928. These journals of a strong literary and artistic profile are composed of studies, poems, short novels, and reproduction of paintings and drawings, and also original engravings, lithographs, as well as ads, advertisement, and different sorts of editorial text. Regarding the methodological framework, we had to cross periodical studies with history of media, as well as of writers, artists, and also public intellectuals. Since the historical avant-garde is a fully transnational phenomenon, the theory and methodology created by professors Michael Werner and Michel Espagne, called cultural transfers, seemed extremely useful for our research as well. Several big challenges we had to face during our work. By putting into context these journals, we needed to set up a framework to handle constantly changing social, political, and economic pressure, as I already stressed you, that had an impact on journal making in a turmoil. Don't forget that Kassák's first journal was published in the first phase of the Great War, the second during a big crisis, during the war for Hungary. Romanian troops were invading Transylvania when Today was launched late autumn 1916. The refundation of Ma took place in exile in Vienna, and the last avant-garde journal of Kassák, Kassák's last avant-garde journal was launched in an extreme uncertainty after he came back to the Hungary of Horthy era. By studying texts and images published by these journals, we have been trying to make visible relationships and networks as well. Our intention has been to probe what kind of relationship had Kassák's journals with the latest foreign avant-garde or modern artistic movements. Also, we had to reveal the hidden antagonisms that oppose Kassák's movement with institutions and individuals. It was seen as a non-national other, a term by Hubert van den Berg, and not only during the war, but also later on, because of its participation in the Hungarian Soviet Republic of Councils in 1919, during his exile in Vienna too, seen from Budapest, of course. Kassák tried to defend their goals in his journals, and not only when facing national conservative power, but also mass politics, the Social Democrats, and even more, the newly emerging Communist Party created on the Russian Bolshevik pattern in late autumn 1918. Also, we had to tackle with the question of censorship. Why during the Great War, Kassák and his journals were censored, the deed that was banned forever. During the Soviet Republic of Councils, that was Kassák himself who was appointed to blue pencil posters. Next, in his exile, several of his works were put on index. Regarding the political and social ideas appearing in the publication of these journals, the study of changing terminology was absolutely necessary as well. The term collective individual and the new man and woman or activism are only the most significant analogies used by the Kassák group and that need to put into context and explained. towards the official end of our project. We are about to finish up our collective monography of approximately 500 pages. We proceeded both individually and collectively. Every member of the research group, we are 4 researchers, and there are among these 4 researchers, one of us is a senior one, Judit Csatlós, who used to be the director of the Kassák Museum and who is the chief editor of this collective monography. And there is another senior member, but he doesn't take part actively in the research process. So we are 4 active members, myself, my colleague Merse, and Gábor Dobó, and the already mentioned Judit Csatlós. We proceeded both individually and collectively. Every member of the research group had his or her own part, but thanks to common research, regular discussions about theory and methods, and by reading each other's chapters, we have been in a constant dialogue with each other. Myself, I authored the first part of our work, Kassák journals during the First World War and in the aftermath. Merse Szeredi, the director of the Kassák Museum, deals with the emigration period when Kassák refounded MA in Vienna, and which became his splendidest journal in artistic terms. Finally, Gábor Dobó's task has been describing Kassák's return to Hungary, the motive of that decision, and examining his last avant-garde journal called Document. As a conclusion, I'm happy to announce that we are lucky to be able to keep together our research team for the next years to come. For the digitalization of the core of Kassák's correspondence he led with his wife, Jolán Simon, another key figure of the Hungarian avant-garde, we have just won a new grant for the next 4 years under the direction of one of our young colleagues, Gábor Dobó. Our new project started a month ago, financed by the same state institutions, is somehow a follow-up with the original project, but with a new focus. The difference is that this time correspondence is in focus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much also, Eszter and Merse. I think, yeah, perfect. Thank you for stop sharing the screen. Now I think it's a time for questions. And I would like to start with one quite admirable, I guess, because I'm quite interested in your research because of many reasons. What I find extremely interesting is that you are somehow, at least it seems to me like that, repeating the situation of avant-garde of the 1920s or something like that, because you have very international, very interdisciplinary in many elements. You are quite there is a broad perspective you are coming towards this kind of a topic, right? So the first question would be, how does that work for you? Because it seems quite complicated for me to find methodologies and strategies how to deal with it. All methodologies are implying different questions, right? And different approaches and different way to answer. So can you explain us how you work on that? Thank you very much.
It's a question for me or for Merse?
I think you can start and we'll see how it works.
Okay, I start. So yeah, it's a very good question, because there was, at the beginning of our research, we did, of course, we didn't have a pattern, what kind of methodology we should base, on what kind of methodology we should base our this whole research process, which is a complicated process, of course. We try to merge, historical approaches. In the French historiography, there is a very enriching sub-historical field. It's a subfield, not a proper field, called History of Public Intellectuals. Of course, public intellectuals in Eastern Europe didn't have and still not have the same influence than in France had public intellectuals in the past or even today. I'm not so sure. Perhaps they also losing their importance by now. But even there is a difference. Even in Eastern Europe, public intellectual figures appeared. Kassák never called himself an intellectual, never. Only writer and artist, but he acted as a public intellectual time to time. Of course, with his anti-war stance, his behavior, his attitude was very similar to other anti-war public intellectuals in the European continent. Bertrand Russell, Romain Rolland, the great pacifist figure. So, of course, Kassák was also a public intellectual, even he didn't want to recognize it for reasons I can't develop here because we are short of time. So the French subfield is a very interesting, and also history of writers and artists and sociology of writers and artists. So historiography and sociology. We've been using very much extensively the theory and method of Pierre Bourdieu. I haven't mentioned in my presentation. However, he's really very, very important for us, but I haven't mentioned so much. I haven't named really academic or scholars, but I only mentioned Michael Werner and Michel Espagne for the culture transfer, but I should have mentioned Pierre Bourdieu, whose theory on the literary field is very, very important for us. We had to reconstruct, because nobody never reconstructed it in details, the whole literary field for this entire period. For the reason we understand how Kassák moved in this field, So we had to reconstruct the mobility, the changing of the literary field, and even the artistic field, because the avant-garde doesn't stop at literature. Of course, we had to have a look at the artistic field, the art field as well. But the literary field was in Hungary, in the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, of course, until 1918. Literary field was greater, was more important than the art field. and even we had to have a look at science, why Kassák and his colleagues and the other writers of this small avant-garde microcosmos were interested in science and what sort of science they were interested in and how they incorporated sciences or scientific terminology in their poems and why. So there are many lot of questions we had to find an answer. Okay, and the culture transfer theory, it's very important as well for the reason, because of the transnational character aspect of the avant-garde.
Yes, thank you very much.
So we had to elaborate. Okay.
Oh yeah, definitely, sure. Follow.
Okay. So just one sentences more. So we had to elaborate our own methodology.
Yeah, okay. Mercy, would you like to elaborate a little bit on this?
Maybe just add one more aspect, which is periodical studies. It's also a very new subfield.
Yes.
It's English, so Brit American, but it's also very useful. A few years back, a big series of handbooks was published on avant-garde and modernist magazines at the Oxford University, and the editors had outlined a very interesting and very useful methodology for analyzing these journals. And we have also been working with that kind of methodological approach, which considers both the material and the intellectual aspects, and also artistic, literary and visual artistic aspects of these magazines.
Okay, what I like quite a lot actually is that you have always a methodology for one part you are following, right? And you have a base, which it seems to me is a literature on some level at least. And I think there are some connection with Czech context, of course, Tajge and his circle and so on. And I know that Eszter wouldn't want to dig too deep in this, but if you mention intellectualism, the first thing I have on my mind is elitism somehow. And I think this is the reason why you didn't want to push this, right? Because the elitism was, it wasn't a theme, it wasn't a problem, or it might be a problem. It's quite complicated, right? So nevertheless, I know you didn't want to dig to this, but would you be able, both of you, to elaborate on this, this kind of element?
Kassák used the term collective individual. It was quite, it was not their innovation because it appeared in German activist periodicals and also at Durkheim's, who was a sociologist, a French sociologist. So, but they used first in a Hungarian context. So they were pioneers in using this term, and they wanted to go beyond in individual, not liberal thinking, but individualism. They wanted to transgress individualism. Of course, during the war, collectivism was stressed by authorities, but Kassák didn't want to go back to individualism to oppose the war. He wanted to find a third way, a third path, and that was collective, individual, which means in his terms that artists can show more or less can show the way, the future for society. That should society should find again art and have a new life, more close to art. So life and art has to be merged again. That was his. That was their goal, purpose.
Yeah, I think this is something to admire, right? This kind of approach, which allows you to be somehow cultural in one sense, but on the other hand, it allows you to be direct and quite practical in the end, in the result itself. It's really up to date, I mean, in the time. Which leads me to contemporary culture and contemporary arts. What I'm interested in is that you have quite complicated research project, but you are applying for it in a museum, which is open to public. So the first step is to again, as Kassák, open it to public, right, and serve the public somehow, educate the public itself. Which leads me to current culture and current artists and their approach, artistic research as such. Is this something which helps you somehow also in your own scientific research, I guess, this cooperation with contemporary artists? Are they able, for example, to give you different approach or different answers to questions you are asking?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. So it's always, I think it's important to integrate these different aspects and work together. So it can always help not to be too much detached from contemporary culture. But of course, it's always it's also very tricky to have my cat to have these different approaches and integrate these different approaches. So, for example, the exhibition of Adam Albert in 2018 about the public space in Budapest during the May Day celebrations during the Soviet Republic was a very important milestone, I guess, in the museum history regarding this collaboration between historians and contemporary artists. But of course, many contemporary artists use different methods of research, not exclusively artistic research, but also visual anthropology or new historical methods. And they work with archives, they work with historical materials, and they try to make sense of the past and of course draw the conclusions that could be also relevant for present time. So I think that as we are a small museum, as we are also a very experimental museum, our topics or choices or collection is very experimental. So we have the opportunity to explore these possibilities and dive deep into artistic collaboration, into exhibitions based on research, and to present even our scientific research through the lens of contemporary artists. So I think that this small scale offers us these possibilities or this freedom, actually, not to be afraid of experimenting. And I think that it's a very interesting aspect of our projects. And if not completely, but at least in this scene, it's very unique.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, this is the reason why I have invited you. Actually, because it's something which should inspire us all, I guess. Now, to be more focused or in the theme, if I am thinking about Kassák, and there are others, of course, not just in Central Europe, like Mid-Sage and Taige and so on. Could you be so kind and somehow elaborate on this differences, similarities which are there? Because this is something which might be interesting for us if we are thinking about Central Europe as a specific domain, for example, if it is specific domain. So could you try to find some sort of similarities and differences in the historical context between Kassák and his generational partners, I guess, in communication? It's for both of you, so we will see how it works.
So Kassák, when he launched his second journal, on the cover page, he published a lithography by Benes. It's a cubist lithography that I could identify more, because Kassák put the name of Benes on the cover page, but of course we didn't know exactly what kind of work of art it was, and from what kind of periodical he could have it. I think I could identify the periodical as well, and thanks to art historians in Prague who had me. So why I stress it, because publishing a cubist painting or drawing or lithography, whatever, was a very tricky thing during the war. Cubism was seen as art of the enemy for both reasons, because of French cubist tradition. So Cubism was seen as coming from France and coming from the enemy. So that's why Kassák, who had a bad experience with his first journal that was banned just before the launching of the second one. So he was more cautious and published only a Czech Cubist artist, because the Czechs were, of course, citizens of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but they were not seen very well in this period by Hungarians, not anymore, because we are in the middle of the war, and the Czechs are already gravitating towards London and and other Entente centers. But yeah, this is the most famous one in the second journal, and of course in more edited in Vienna there are other important things. With Germans, there are much more connections with German artists, and
I was also thinking about personalities. I mean, Micic in Zagreb as again someone who is able to establish around himself quite a circle, right, of artists and journals and all the production, artistic production. I mean, or Taige, same situation in Prague, and not just in Prague, and they were all connected together, right? When you were showing the covers of journals, it was quite visible how connected the world was for them. But I imagine all of them choose different strategies to work somehow, because they had different languages and operated in different cultural fields somehow.
And Kassák didn't speak any foreign language. so he had to so it was with help of the others he could read texts, but he could, of course, pick up pictures, images he liked. So it was not a language dependable thing.
Or we have another language, right? Visual language, which quite
yes. Images are an international, have an international
and typography.
Language.
Yeah.
And typography as well. Yes.
Yeah, this is something special, I guess. I think I would ask you one last question, and it would be, well, there are thousands of questions, right? But I was very interested in what you said about letters you have and you are trying to work with. So I wanted to ask you about them, if there is something really surprising, something we should expect to be like a bomb in the field, because there would be a different interpretation of the situation, for example, and it's again for both of you. It would be very nice if you could share some personal investigation, also something surprising which you found, not just necessarily in letters, but also in journals, something which is really somehow glue you to the topic, which fascinates you, and you would like to follow it in subsequent grant you've received, because this is very good news. So Eszter, you might ask, and then Merche. Thank you.
Something like a bomb in the correspondence. I don't know yet the entire correspondence. But what I realized, what I observed, that Kassák has a broader network than we can think originally. In Hungary, he had much more connections with, so-called bourgeois writers and mecenas, and so it's interesting. So one thing are the publications, and another the correspondence and networking with Hungarian editors and publishing house and mecenas. So it's something I find interesting, but yeah. So it's the underworld. This is the world we don't see when we just looking at the journals and reading the publications, reading the studies and essays and glossas, which can be very harsh towards institutions and public figures of the bourgeois society. So okay, but it doesn't mean that Kassák was a hypocrite, or he had a Janus. He had the Janus-faced. He was a Janus-faced figure. It means he had to deal with the Hungarian context, and to make run his journal, he had to he had to networking with Hungarians, So it's interesting for me. I don't know if Merche know about the bomb in the correspondence. Do you know about the bomb, Merche?
The whole thing is, yeah, actually it's a long process, and it's very complex, because we have most of the correspondence but not all. So for example, the editorial correspondence of Kassák, which he was conducting during the 20s when he was editing his magazines on an international scale, so those are lost. So we have to go to the archives of other artists throughout Europe, Kurt Schwitter, Stefan Dusberg, Tristan Tzara, and look for those letters which Kassák sent to them. So then at least we will have 1/2 of the correspondence. But I think more interestingly, the addition of this personal correspondence of Kassák sheds light to his partner, Jolán Simon. She was also a person coming from the working class. She was a factory worker. She had 3 children and a failed marriage when he met Kassák. And they started their artistic career together. And they decided to do something different with their lives together. And Jolán Simon was never a writer. She only has one piece of writing published about speaking choirs, which she wrote during the late 1920s when she was working with young intellectuals and young workers. And she started to read about the theory of these speaking choirs. But she was well behind Kassák and behind this whole movement from the very beginning up until the late 1930s when she died. And actually the main part of the correspondence that we are working with is the personal / editorial correspondence between Kassák and Jolán Simon. They were discussing everything, they were deciding things together, and Jolán Simon was very much active in providing the financial background for the magazine. She was working several jobs. She was selling the magazine. She was collecting the subscription money, and also during the 20s when Kassák was in Vienna, she was smuggling the magazine back to Budapest because she was not excluded. She was not an immigrant in Vienna. She was able to travel. So she was even involved in smuggling Kassák's works back into Budapest. And this correspondence is a very, very different one from the the classical situation of the artist and the muse. It's a working relationship, and they were creating these things together. But we never talk about Jolán Simon because she was not a published writer or not a published artist. So she just sunk in the history, and now she is referred to as Kassák's wife, even though they only got married in 1928. So for at least half of their career, they were not married, they were just partners living together. And my colleague Gabor Dobó, he's working with the career, with the life of Jolán Simon. We're going to present his results in an exhibition during early 2023. So within 2 years' time, we will still have time to prepare for the exhibition. But also during this research project, Jolán Simon is elevated even into the title of the research project, because we really want to stress that it's not only about Kassák. And I think the main revelations lie here when you go very close and you start to examine what went down and how did it go down. And I think this current project that we are actually just finishing up now, the exhibition about Kassák's younger sister and her wife. They were both poets, and so the younger sister and her husband.
And her husband.
They were both poets, and they were working together with Kassák up until 1922. Then they had an ideologically driven breakup. They later exiled to the Soviet Union. They were executed. So it's a very complex, very sad story. But if we look at their lives...
Not both of them, only him.
Yeah. I just
she survived.
Simplifying, yeah. She died.
Yes.
She died a few months later, yeah. But so the whole story is very complex. And if you try to look at different aspects, different points of view, the aspects of women working class writer appearing in or publishing in avant-garde magazines. What did she think about? What was her focus? What was her approach? How was it affected by the ideas of communism? How did it evolve throughout her career? So I think these are very interesting and very current questions, which were not yet asked before. So there's still, very much to do, even with this very small Hungarian avant-garde group. So I think that's the beauty, or that's the most interesting part of this research, to find out about these figures who were once very much involved in these movements, but now we don't even know about their story.
Thank you very much for that. I actually think it's very nice and very good closing remark, because both things you've said, this kind of, because it's really something which is very rich and very special to be able to look behind the curtain and see the real aspects of the work itself. I would like to thank you both for that. For that view we had. Thanks to you and thanks to Kassák Museum. I'm really very proud that you were on board of the Triennial and of SEFO. You were our first special guest, and it always will be like that. Kassák Museum was the first guest of SEFO for 2021, and it was really lovely to host you. So thank you both. I really do hope we'll meet in Budapest very soon, or in Olomouc, for discussion and for the visit. I also hope very much that quite a lot of Czech tourists in Budapest will go not just to Bath, but also to the museum to learn something about Kassák. We still have the quiz before ourselves, ahead of us. We should find winners for tickets to visit Kassák Museum in Budapest. So yeah, let's meet in a real life also, not just on online space. Okay.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I would like to thank everyone who was involved in the organization and the technical organization of this lecture series, and I would thank everyone who had attended and listened to these 4 presentations in the virtual space, because we are really happy that we were able to present our current projects and a little bit also about the whole history of the museum. So thank you once again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Let's meet in Budapest, and let's meet in Olomouc.
Yeah, let's do that.
In the close future. Thank you very much.
You too. Have a lovely evening. Take care. Stay healthy. And I'd like to see you next day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.